The first thing my mother did when she saw my name on the office door was stop breathing for half a second. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for me to notice the tiny crack in the perfect composure she had spent her entire life protecting. Dr. Claire Bennett, MD. The brushed gold lettering sat beneath the frosted glass. My father stared at it like he was trying to convince himself he had read it wrong. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Soft jazz drifted through hidden ceiling speakers while rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Neither of them spoke, neither of them moved. And for the first time in 16 years, they were the ones waiting for me. My younger brother Mason sat between them. He looked thinner than I remembered, hollow around the eyes and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. His hands trembled slightly inside the sleeves of his gray hoodie. 3 weeks earlier, he had called my office himself. I almost didn't answer. We had not spoken in nearly 2 years. When I finally picked up, he stayed silent for several seconds before saying 6 words. "I think I need your help, Claire." Now he sat in my waiting room, staring at the floor while my mother kept rubbing his shoulder nervously, whispering little reassurances into his ear the same way she used to before his football games in high school. She used to call him her bright boy, her miracle child. Back then, our entire house revolved around Mason, his schedules, his moods, his future, and me. I learned early that my role in the Bennett family was to take up as little space as possible. Before I tell you why my parents suddenly needed the daughter they once sent away, I want to ask you something. Have you ever spent so long trying to become invisible that one day you realize people had stopped seeing you altogether? And if you have, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because the loneliest stories always seem to find the people who need them most. We lived in a polished two-story house outside Milwaukee, where appearances mattered more than honesty. My father sold luxury real estate. My mother chaired charity committees and church fundraisers. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied: matching Christmas cards, perfect lawn, expensive smiles. But inside that house, there was an unspoken rule everybody followed without ever admitting it existed. Mason mattered. I complicated things. By 16, I had already mastered the art of silence. I knew how to hide panic attacks behind locked bathroom doors. I knew how to smile through dinner while my chest felt so tight I could barely breathe. I knew how to say, "I'm fine," before anyone had the chance to sound irritated asking twice. But the truth was, something inside me had started breaking long before anyone noticed. And the night my parents finally decided they were done dealing with me started with a slammed door, cold rain, and my mother saying 5 words I still hear in my sleep. "We cannot keep living like this anymore." My mother said it quietly from the kitchen doorway, but somehow that made it worse. The dishwasher hummed softly behind her. The smell of tomato soup still lingered in the air from a dinner nobody had really eaten. Outside, rainwater slid down the windows in crooked silver lines, blurring the porch lights into pale streaks. I stood near the staircase, still clutching the strap of my backpack so tightly my fingers ached. Across the living room, my father sat in his leather chair pretending to read emails on his phone, though I could tell by the stiffness in his jaw that he was listening to every word. Mason was upstairs, safe, untouched by any of this. "I said I was sorry," I whispered. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to, fragile and exhausted. Earlier that afternoon, the school counselor had called home after I locked myself in a bathroom during a panic attack. I heard my mother's embarrassment before she even picked me up. Not concern, embarrassment. She spent the entire drive home gripping the steering wheel so tightly her wedding ring kept tapping against the leather. "Do you understand how humiliating this is for us?" she asked, without once looking at me, like my pain had become an inconvenience she needed hidden before the neighbors noticed. Back then, I still believed if I explained myself carefully enough, calmly enough, maybe they would finally understand that I was not trying to make life difficult. I was drowning. But people only throw ropes to someone they want to save. My mother crossed her arms. Your father and I have done everything we can. I looked at him instinctively. He still would not meet my eyes. Claire, he said finally, his voice carrying the same professional tone he used with difficult clients, this family has been walking on eggshells around you for months. Months. Like my existence had become some unbearable burden they deserved credit for tolerating. I didn't ask for this, I said softly. I know, my mother replied. That is the problem. Silence settled over the room. Heavy. Permanent. Somewhere upstairs, Mason laughed at something on television, completely disconnected from the storm unfolding below him. Then my mother walked to the front closet, grabbed my overnight bag, and placed it beside the door. The school counselor recommended a crisis assessment center outside Madison, she said carefully. They can help you learn coping skills. Someone like me, someone difficult, someone inconvenient. My stomach dropped. You are sending me away? My father finally stood up and looked at me for exactly 2 seconds before saying the words that shattered something inside me forever. We think this is what is best for everyone. The drive to Madison lasted almost 3 hours, though it felt longer because nobody spoke. Rain hammered against the windshield while my father kept both hands locked at 10 and 2 like he was driving through a blizzard instead of dismantling his own family. My overnight bag sat beside me in the back seat, half-zipped, one sweater sleeve hanging out awkwardly like even my clothes were trying to escape. My mother stared out the passenger window the entire time. Occasionally, she checked her phone. Once, she smiled faintly at something Mason had texted her. That hurt more than anything else. Life was still moving normally for them. Meanwhile, my entire world was quietly being erased mile by mile. The crisis center sat on the edge of a wooded property behind black iron gates. Warm yellow lights glowed through the windows, but the building itself felt detached from the rest of the world. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A woman at the front desk handed my parents paperwork, while another staff member asked if I would mind speaking with a counselor privately first. My mother hesitated. My father hesitated. Then they both said yes. The counselor introduced herself as Susan Keller. She wore silver-framed glasses and spoke in a calm, even voice that made the room feel slightly less frightening. Unlike everyone else that night, she looked directly at me when she spoke. Claire, your school counselor said you've been having panic attacks. Can you tell me what has been going on? I stared at the paper cup of water in my hands. The answer felt too big, too tangled. I don't know, I whispered. Susan nodded slowly. Okay, then let me ask you something else. When you think about going home tonight, how do you feel? Nobody had ever asked me a question like that before. I looked down at the tiny crack in the plastic lid covering my water cup. Such a small fracture, but impossible not to notice once you saw it. Tired, I said quietly. Susan waited. Scared sometimes. She remained silent for another moment. Scared of what? My throat tightened. For one terrifying second, I almost told her everything. About the screaming behind closed doors. About the way my father stopped speaking to me for days whenever I embarrassed him publicly. About hearing my mother cry late at night. About finding orange prescription bottles scattered across the upstairs bathroom counter with labels missing and caps never fully closed. About Mason sleeping through entire weekends while everyone pretended not to notice. But fear is a strange thing. Sometimes it does not make you run. Sometimes it makes you protect the very people hurting you. So I lowered my eyes and whispered, I guess I make things harder for everybody. Susan did not say anything right away. She simply watched me with an expression I could not read. Then she asked very gently, Claire, has anyone in your family ever asked you to keep secrets that made you uncomfortable? And for the first time that night, my heart started beating so hard I could hear it. I should have lied. Even now, all these years later, part of me still wonders what would have happened if I had smiled weakly, shaken my head, and said no like I always did. But something about Susan's question changed everything. Maybe it was because she was the first adult who seemed interested in understanding me instead of managing me. Or maybe I was simply too tired to keep carrying secrets that were never mine to begin with. I looked down at my hands. Sometimes, I said quietly. Susan did not interrupt. She just waited. There are things nobody talks about in our house. My voice sounded strangely distant, like it belonged to someone else. Things we're supposed to ignore. I swallowed hard. Like what? For a second, I almost changed my mind. Then I remembered finding Mason asleep on the hallway floor one Saturday afternoon, while my mother stood over him crying softly into a dish towel. I remembered seeing orange prescription bottles on the bathroom counter with the labels peeled off. I remembered my father's face every time I asked if Mason was okay. My brother has not been himself for a long time, I whispered. He sleeps all the time. Sometimes he can barely stay awake during dinner. My parents keep saying he's just stressed. Susan nodded slowly. Anything else? My heart was pounding now. I think, I think there are medications in our house that nobody wants to talk about. The room went very still. Susan's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Has anyone ever asked you to lie about those medications? I hesitated. No. Not exactly. I thought about it again, but they ask me not to ask questions. Susan folded her hands carefully in her lap. Claire, I need you to understand something. You are not responsible for protecting adults from the consequences of their choices. Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. The words landed somewhere deep inside my chest. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A staff member stepped inside and handed Susan a note. She read it, thanked him quietly, and looked back at me. Your parents are filling out paperwork, she said. Your school counselor also sent over some additional concerns from your recent sessions. I felt my stomach tighten. Am I in trouble? Susan's expression softened. No, Claire. I do not think you are in trouble. She paused for a moment. I think you might be carrying things that no 16-year-old should have to carry alone. I stared at her. Something hot and painful climbed into my throat. Because I could not remember the last time anyone had looked at me and seen someone overwhelmed instead of someone difficult. Susan glanced at the note one more time before setting it aside. Then she looked directly at me and asked a question that changed the entire night. Claire, if I gave you a choice right now, would you want to go back home tonight? I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Because for the first time in my life, I realized I did not know. I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Because for the first time in my life, someone had asked what I wanted instead of deciding it for me. Susan did not rush me. She simply waited. Outside her office, I could hear faint voices drifting down the hallway and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, I looked down at my hands and whispered, I do not know. Saying it out loud felt strangely frightening. I had spent so many years trying to survive inside our family that I had never stopped to ask myself what safety even looked like. Susan nodded gently, as if my answer made perfect sense. That is okay, she said. Not knowing is okay. Then she stood. I would like to speak with your parents for a few minutes. Would you be comfortable waiting here? I nodded. The second she stepped out of the office, the room felt different somehow. Quieter. I stared at the half-empty cup of water in front of me and tried to slow my breathing. Then I heard my father's voice. At first it was too muffled to understand. Then it became louder, sharper. I could not make out every word, but I recognized his tone immediately. It was the voice he used whenever things slipped beyond his control. A few seconds later, my mother's voice joined his. She sounded frightened. Then I heard something else. My name. I froze. Their voices dropped again, becoming impossible to understand. Another few moments passed. Then my father's voice rose once more. She does not know everything. Silence. My mother said something I could not hear. Then my father spoke again, low and urgent. If she starts talking about the pills, this becomes a completely different situation. My breath caught. Pills. The word seemed to echo inside my head. Suddenly, every strange memory from the past year began rearranging itself. Mason sleeping through entire weekends. My mother's red eyes after locking herself in the bathroom. The orange prescription bottles with missing labels. The late-night arguments. The constant tension that nobody would explain. I had spent so long believing I was the problem that I had never considered something else might be wrong inside our house. The office door opened unexpectedly, making me jump. Susan stepped back inside and immediately noticed my expression. "Claire?" she asked softly. I looked at her, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. "What pills?" I whispered. Susan did not answer right away. Instead, she pulled her chair a little closer and sat down across from me. "Can you tell me why you're asking that?" I swallowed hard. I heard my dad. My voice sounded shaky now. He said if I talked about pills. I stopped. Even saying the words felt dangerous somehow. Susan remained very still. "Claire," she said carefully, "has anyone in your home been taking medication that worried you?" I thought about Mason asleep on the hallway carpet, about his trembling hands, about how exhausted he always looked, about my mother's tears. And for the first time, a thought entered my mind that I had been avoiding for months. Maybe I had not been the only person in our family falling apart. Maybe I had not been the only person in our family falling apart. The thought sat heavily in my chest while Susan waited quietly across from me. I looked down at the paper cup in my hands. "My brother sleeps all the time," I said softly. "He used to play football. He used to be loud, now he's tired all the time." I swallowed hard. "Sometimes he can barely keep his eyes open at dinner." Susan nodded gently, encouraging me to continue. "I've seen prescription bottles in our bathroom before. The labels were gone." I paused. Whenever I ask questions, everybody gets upset. The room fell silent again. Susan folded her hands together. "Claire, has anyone ever made you feel responsible for keeping these concerns to yourself?" I thought about my mother crying in the hallway. I thought about my father saying Mason was simply stressed. I thought about all the times I convinced myself I was imagining things. "I guess so," I said quietly. Susan's expression softened. "That sounds like a very heavy burden for someone your age." Something inside me tightened painfully, because she kept talking about burdens, things being heavy, carrying too much. And suddenly I realized how exhausted I really was. There was another soft knock at the door. This time, a staff member stepped inside and handed Susan a note. She read it quickly, then looked back at me. "I need to explain something to you, Claire." Her voice remained calm, but there was a seriousness to it now. "Based on what you've shared tonight and some concerns raised by your school counselor, I cannot simply send everyone home without asking a few more questions." My stomach dropped. Did I do something wrong? "No," she said it immediately. "You did nothing wrong." She leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes when young people describe feeling unsafe or overwhelmed at home, we have a responsibility to understand the situation better." I stared at her. "What happens now?" "For tonight, nothing dramatic." She offered a small, reassuring smile. "I would like another counselor to speak with you. I would also like to have a separate conversation with your parents." I nodded slowly, though my pulse had started racing again. "Will my parents be angry?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Something flickered across Susan's face. "Sadness, maybe?" "Right now," she said gently, "I think everyone in your family is scared." Before I could respond, voices suddenly rose outside the office. My father's voice, then my mother's. They weren't shouting exactly, but they were speaking louder than before. I saw Susan glance toward the door. A few seconds later, another knock came. A man in a county identification jacket stepped into the room. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. "Sorry to interrupt," he said quietly to Susan. "I was asked to stop by in case additional support is needed." I looked at him confused. Susan turned back to me. "Claire, this is Mr. Harris. He works with County Family Services." My heart skipped. Family Services. The words sounded enormous, official, frightening. Mr. Harris smiled gently. "Nobody is in trouble tonight, Claire. We're just making sure everyone is okay." I nodded, but my hands had started shaking again, because out in the hallway, I could still hear my parents arguing. And for the first time in my life, I had the strange, terrifying feeling that whatever secrets had been living inside our house were no longer staying there. For the first time in my life, I had the strange, terrifying feeling that whatever secrets had been living inside our house were no longer staying there. The voices outside grew louder for another few seconds, and then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed felt even worse. Mr. Harris remained near the door while Susan watched me carefully. "Claire," she said gently, "I need to ask one more question. Has anyone in your family ever asked you to say something that wasn't true?" I frowned slightly. Like lying? Maybe. Or maybe just going along with a story that made you uncomfortable. I thought about it. At first, nothing came to mind. Then another memory surfaced. 2 months earlier, my father had injured his back while showing a property to clients. He came home with prescription pain medication and spent several days resting upstairs. A week later, I noticed the orange bottles in the bathroom for the first time. Then I remembered something else. One evening, I had asked my mother why there seemed to be so many pill bottles around the house. She looked startled for a split second and said they belonged to me. To me. I blinked. My breathing slowed. "Actually," I whispered. Susan waited. "One night, my mom said some of the medication in the house was mine." The room became very still. "Was it?" Susan asked carefully. I shook my head immediately. "No. My doctor prescribed me a small bottle of anxiety medication months ago. I barely used any of it." My pulse was racing now. There were way more bottles than that. Susan and Mr. Harris exchanged a quick glance. Neither of them spoke. Suddenly, another memory crashed into place. Last month, my mother had insisted on picking up my prescription herself because I was staying late at school. Then there had been additional prescriptions that I didn't remember requesting. I had even joked to myself that my doctor must think I misplaced medication constantly. I remembered thinking it was strange because I still had pills left in my drawer. I looked at Susan, confusion slowly turning into something colder. "I never asked for those refills." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Susan leaned slightly closer. "Claire, are you saying medication may have been obtained under your name without your knowledge?" The question made my stomach drop, because until that moment, I had never put all the pieces together. The extra pill bottles, the missing labels, my parents' fear, my father's words outside the office. If she starts talking about the pills, this becomes a completely different situation. I looked at Susan, then at Mr. Harris. And for the first time that night, I realized something that frightened me even more than being sent away. My parents had never been afraid that I was unstable. They had been afraid that I knew something. The office door suddenly opened before anyone could say another word. My mother stepped inside first. Her mascara was smudged. My father followed behind her, his face pale and tight with tension. The moment he saw my expression, he stopped walking. He knew. Somehow, he knew everything had changed. My mother looked from me to Susan and then back again. "Claire," she said quickly, forcing a shaky smile, "we're going home." Nobody moved. My father looked directly at me, and for the first time in my 16 years of knowing him, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. For the first time in my 16 years of knowing him, I saw something in my father's eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. not frustration, not disappointment, fear. My mother took another step into the room, her smile trembling at the edges. "Claire, sweetheart, it's late. Let's just go home." I stared at her. Home. The word no longer sounded comforting. It sounded like a place where things were hidden, where everyone pretended, where I had somehow become both the problem and the excuse. Susan remained seated beside me. "Mrs. Bennet," she said calmly, "we still need to have a few more conversations tonight." My mother's expression tightened. "This has already gone too far." My father finally spoke. "Claire is tired. She's overwhelmed. This entire situation has been blown completely out of proportion." His voice had regained some of its old steadiness, the same controlled tone he used whenever he wanted people to believe everything was under control. But I knew him too well. I saw the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand. Mr. Harris stepped forward quietly. "Mr. Bennet, nobody is making accusations tonight. We're simply trying to understand the situation." My father looked at him, then at Susan, then at me. "You've frightened my daughter enough for one evening." The words landed strangely, because they sounded protective, but for some reason they made my stomach twist. I looked at him carefully. "Dad," I said softly. He immediately turned toward me. Why were there refills under my name? The room went completely silent. My mother's face drained of color. My father's expression froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "What?" my mother whispered. I kept looking at him. "I didn't ask for those prescriptions." My voice shook slightly now. I still had medication left. My father said nothing. I could actually see him thinking, calculating, searching for an answer that would put everything back where it belonged. But there wasn't one. My mother looked at him slowly. "Robert?" she said again, her voice barely audible. He still didn't answer. Something changed in her face. Fear became confusion. Then confusion became realization. "Robert," she whispered. My father finally closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them again, he looked older somehow. Tired, defeated. "Mason was struggling," he said quietly. My heart stopped. My mother stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He looked at her as if he had forgotten she didn't know everything either. "I was trying to manage it," he said hoarsely. "I thought I could fix it myself." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Manage what?" He swallowed hard. "The pills." Nobody moved. My mother looked like she had stopped understanding the English language entirely. "What pills?" she whispered. My father finally looked at me, then at Susan, then at the floor. "Mason became dependent after my surgery," my father said quietly. "I made a terrible decision. I thought I could manage it myself until I found real help." The words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. My mother's eyes widened. "No." It came out almost like a plea. "No, that's not possible." But her voice lacked conviction because somewhere deep down she already knew. She had seen him sleeping all weekend. Seen his hands shake, seen him slowly disappear. She had simply been too afraid to name it. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "You told me he was exhausted," she whispered. "You said he was stressed." My father looked completely broken now. "I thought I could handle it." My mother stared at him in disbelief. "And Claire?" Her voice cracked. "What does Claire have to do with any of this?" My father didn't answer. He didn't have to, because suddenly every strange thing that had happened over the past year made horrible, perfect sense. The extra prescriptions, the refill requests, the way everyone kept insisting I was unstable, the way I had somehow become the center of every concern while nobody talked about Mason. I looked at my father, and a realization so painful I could barely breathe settled inside my chest. Somewhere along the way, I had become the easier child to sacrifice. Somewhere along the way, I had become the easier child to sacrifice. The realization settled over me so heavily that for a moment I could not speak. My mother looked from my father to me and then back again, tears spilling freely down her face now. "No," she whispered. "No, we would never." But the sentence never finished because all four of us already knew the truth. Maybe she had not known every detail. Maybe she had not understood where the extra prescriptions came from. But she had seen me struggling. She had watched me have panic attacks. She had heard me say I was scared. And somehow, I had still become the child sent away. My father slowly lowered himself into one of the plastic chairs. He suddenly looked like a man carrying something far heavier than his own body could support. "I was trying to protect this family," he said quietly. Nobody answered. "I thought if people found out Mason needed help," his voice broke for the first time all night, "everything would fall apart." Susan spoke gently. "Sometimes trying to protect a family means telling the truth before the damage becomes bigger." My father stared at the floor. "I know that now." The room remained silent for several long seconds. Then I heard another voice. "Dad?" Everyone turned. Mason stood in the doorway. He looked pale and exhausted, his gray hoodie damp from the rain outside. I later learned he had found the address in my mother's messages and convinced one of his teammates to drive him there. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, but judging by his expression, long enough. My mother let out a broken sound and rushed toward him. He didn't move. He just kept looking at our father. "You used Claire?" he asked quietly. My father said nothing. Mason swallowed hard. "To protect me?" Still nothing. My brother looked at me then, and I saw something in his face that I had never seen before. Shame, grief, understanding. "I didn't know," he said softly. "Claire, I swear I didn't know." And strangely, I believed him. Because standing there in that doorway, he didn't look like the golden child anymore. He looked like someone who had been drowning just as long as I had, just in a different way. Tears filled his eyes. "I thought you hated me." My chest tightened painfully. "I thought you hated me too," I admitted. A sad little laugh escaped him. "I guess we were both wrong." My mother started crying harder. My father covered his face with one hand. Nobody looked perfect anymore. Nobody looked successful or respectable or put together. We just looked like a family. A broken one. But finally, an honest one. Looking back now, I realized that the 16-year-old girl who walked into that crisis center believed she was difficult, fragile, and somehow less worthy of love than everyone else. I walked out of that crisis center understanding something entirely different. I was never the problem that needed fixing. I was simply the child who noticed the cracks first. Recovery did not happen overnight. It took years. Therapy, boundaries, awkward conversations, long silences. Mason eventually got the treatment he needed. A few weeks before calling my office, he had started having cravings again. This time, instead of hiding, he remembered I was the only person in our family who had ever learned how to sit with pain instead of pretending it wasn't there. He told me later that he called because he needed a doctor. But more than that, he needed his sister. My mother learned that loving someone does not mean protecting appearances. My father took a leave of absence from work after everything came out. Several longtime clients stopped calling. A few friendships quietly disappeared. For the first time in his life, he had to sit alone with consequences he could not manage or explain away. And somewhere during those quiet years, I think he finally learned that control and love are not the same thing. Sometimes people ask me if I forgave my parents. The truth is more complicated than that. Forgiveness is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small decisions. Some days it looks like returning a phone call. Some days it looks like keeping your distance. And some days it simply means accepting that the people who hurt you were often hurting too. 2 years later, I found my father sitting alone in my waiting room with a paper bag of blueberry muffins in his lap because he remembered they used to be my favorite. He looked up at me and said, "I spent your whole childhood trying to protect the wrong person." Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I sat down beside him. I still think about that rainy night in Madison, the smell of coffee in the counseling office, the sound of rain against the windows, the moment someone finally asked me how I felt instead of telling me how I should feel, because that was the night everything changed. Not because my family finally saw me, but because, for the very first time, I saw myself